Uh, Hi again, I guess. Um, there wasn't a regular video this April, and probably in February if I didn't consider that rant video as a regular one. But I guess I will now because I have no choice. It's been fairly busy, and so that means we're going to be back here again with another unscripted discussion, I guess. Because I do not have my DSLR with me right now, and even if I wanted to script something, it is currently exam week for us, and I do not have the time to properly prepare that. But I do want to talk about something that's been gnawing at me for a fairly long time now. Probably seeing from my script right here, it's been well over a year at this point. So last year, essentially, um, I made a sort of concept script that I initially thought could probably be a video, though at this point, most of the details that I put in here are fairly um, outdated, to put it as charitably as I can, because technology is moving so fast now that M1 is basically like yesterday's technology, right? I'll talk about more of that in a little bit, but essentially, I made a script last year that was in a sort of video essay format about a future in computing and what I thought was going to happen within the next few years as new technology evolves and as the pace of evolution continues to ramp due to increased competition, right? So to give a bit of context here, this was written during the I wouldn't say tail end, more like during the time of the graphics card shortage and the effects of M1 being so felt around the industry, right? This was a time when M1 was still fresh in people's minds, and the transition from Intel's x86 to Apple's Silicon ARM was still underway for Mac, right? And so you can probably already tell what's going to be in this script, but I'm going to be reading its introduction now. So I'll be putting the intro probably right here, and we'll see how this goes. Computing has become as democratized as ever, and nowadays almost everyone has access to devices that contain computing power rivaling that of supercomputers from decades past. This incredibly rapid pace has been further accelerated in recent years due to intensifying competition across all areas of consumer technology. From CPUs and GPUs that power monster workstations and gaming PCs, phone SoCs that contain desktop power in handheld devices, and the likes. Never before have we seen this rapid pace of innovation across the entire industry since the start of the new millennium, and it's likely to continue in the next few years. This has opened an exciting but unclear question in every tech enthusiast's minds. What would all of this result in the next coming years? How long will this last? And will this be another rapid time frame for innovation before the inevitable stagnation sets in? It's becoming time to discuss the future of personal computing, what I think will happen in the next few years. Okay, so pretentious ending for that intro aside, that's essentially what this video is going to be about, except it's going to be less scripted and more throwing around my opinion after a year of writing this script, as well as just my general thoughts on what's literally going to happen within the next few years as all of this evolves, right? This is a continually evolving, I wouldn't say problem, I wouldn't say issue either, but it's a continually evolving phenomenon that the tech industry in particular is going through. So, chapter one here is Moore's Law Reborn. So I started this essay with a reminder of what has happened within the last 5 years, right? The increased competition in the CPU space, the decline in Intel's dominance, and eventual fall to its ascendant rivals like AMD, TSMC, Nvidia, etc., right? And of course, Apple has become a rival in and of itself after M1 came along. And so I wanted to discuss the essay first by giving the background onto what happened within the last 5 years, so that we can define a momentum that we can at least draw a trajectory towards, right? So let's start with that. And of course, we can't talk about that without talking about Ryzen's release in 2017, right? And of and prior to that, Intel's complete dominance in the CPU space. After the Sandy Bridge Ivy Bridge versus bulldozer fight within the early 2010s, there was essentially no competition for the next half decade within the CPU space, right? AMD became very uncompetitive due to their problems with architecture, with bulldozers, extremely flawed architecture in particular. And of course, the fact that the fabs that they were relying on, like global foundries, have been lagging behind in technology from the likes of especially Intel. At this point, Intel's dominance across their area of expertise has become so strong that they look like invincible, right? Even with a few stumbles, like the delay of Broadwell, delay and eventual non-desktop release of Broadwell, the delay for 14 nanometer Skylake, right? And the slowing pace of innovation that they were conducting and focusing more on mobile instead of the desktop, which used to be their forte. Mobile and servers became their focus instead of the desktop that has essentially led them to this point, right? The slow in innovation was brought about by this lack of competition, right? But of course, this wouldn't last forever. Companies are companies and they will continually evolve over time, even if they are on the back foot for now. And AMD's return to form essentially ended that half decade of stagnation within a couple of essentially years, right? It started with Ryzen, Zen 1, and then continuing up to Zen 2. They were already on par, almost on par with Intel in terms of gaming and single-threaded performance, higher in IPC but lower in clock speeds, better efficiency as well, and they also have the multi-threaded crown. And they only realistically pushed the dagger forwards in 2020 to 2021 with the release of Zen 3, which essentially took the crown from Intel entirely. This was the first time since, I would say, Athlon, that AMD had unquestionably the leadership in terms of the CPU space, right? And on the other side of the fence, Intel's process had lagged behind, mostly because of delays with their 10 nanometer process, right? This thing was supposed to launch in 2018, but by 2021, it wasn't even clear if they would be able to release Tiger Lake in massive enough quantities in order to properly compete against Zen 3 Mobile. This was the predicament that Intel found themselves in after half a decade of no competition, and that, of course, led to a rapid industry revival that coincided with the pandemic and the increased demand for PC parts due to having to work from home. So this was the backdrop from where my essay started, and I've already started actually with the second chapter with it, but let's continue on and talk about process nodes. The node conversation over the last few years has become more nuanced than it used to be. Like, this node is better, this node is worse, etc. like that. Because it's essentially come down to architecture at this point. That doesn't mean that process nodes don't mean anything anymore completely. Like, there's a reason why companies are always chasing after the most advanced and cutting edge nodes for their processes, right? It gives them a benefit. It's a benefit of efficiency. It's the benefit of, well, used to be a benefit of cost, but now that wafer costs have not just plateaued but slowly rised back up. I don't know how long that will last. But anyways, companies are always chasing for the latest and greatest nodes if they can, and whatever is practical, as practically as possible, and as cutting edge as possible. right? And that's all to balance out the factors for efficiency, die size, and cost. And over the last little bit, as I said, Intel has lagged behind a lot, especially to TSMC, which is already producing 3 nanometer nodes for Apple, when Intel is still stuck trying to figure out how the devil to get their former 7 nanometer, now Intel 4 process working so that they can freaking release a processor for desktop. Sound familiar? Meteor Lake is essentially going to be either Tiger Lake or Broadwell in terms of release. It's not going to come to desktop fully. There will be, for now, from all the leaks that we know, there won't be a flagship Meteor Lake. And that's going to be a problem for Intel when AMD is slowly but surely getting to their next architecture with a much more advanced node. It's not going to be completely an unfair fight here because, again, architecture plays a much better role in terms of actually building something for performance and efficiency. And Intel essentially showed that with Alder Lake. They're able to push their performance forward despite having a less sophisticated node at the cost of efficiency, right? And that's going to be a trade-off that for some people may be worth it, for others maybe not, and that's essentially the rule of competition so that we can decide which one we want. And so, while Intel has clearly known about their position now and is planning on an aggressive roadmap to have, was it like 5 process nodes within the next 5 years, which is essentially an aggressive pace for the company, much more aggressive than even TikTok was back in the days of Core and Sandy Bridge. But they aren't really expected to, like, there are doubts within the industry whether they can even execute it properly at all. And even if they do, where would that land them? Like, would that even land them towards the front of the race or just in line with their competitors, right? And who knows what's going to happen after that cadence expires? Will Intel be able to continue that momentum? Will they push the envelope forward or will they also just become complacent again? And this race towards more cutting edge nodes is bleeding into consumer industry, right? Because as we get more and more dense and more efficient nodes, companies are more and more incentivized to use that efficiency, that envelope, that power budget that's been afforded to them by process optimizations, by architectural optimizations. And instead of giving us more efficient products, turning the heat up significantly just to edge out the competition by a few percentage points. That's essentially what's going on here. You can see that in the GPU space, right? At the top end of the stack, NVIDIA's 4090 consumes bonkers amounts of power, like 400 to 500 watts of TGP is ridiculous when you consider that not a few short years ago, the maximum TGP for a GPU was literally less than 300 watts. And that trend of the ceiling of power consumption going higher and higher isn't going to stop at all, despite the increase in efficiency. And we know there is an increase in efficiency because if you look just a few steps down in their product stack, the 4070 has the same amount of performance as a 3090 or a 3090 Ti for literally half the power consumption. We know that these architectures are efficient, and we know that these are the result of the optimizations that's been going on in the background. But at the top end, we're not seeing any stop in terms of power consumption creep. We're seeing it going higher and higher and higher, gen after gen after gen. Yes, efficiency is increasing by the watt, by every performance metric. Wattage use has gone down, and by every wattage, performance has gone up. But that still leaves room for a power consumption creep that is not at all comforting, to say the least. The world is going through a power crisis right now. That's no joke. I wrote that literally a year ago, and it's still true now, and it's going to be true for as long as the debate between fossil fuels and renewables and nuclear and whatever else is going on in the world right now continues. This power crisis is going to collide with the largest increase in maximum power consumption in PC history since the dawn of the 21st century, right? Ampere was the first straw. It was continued for Lovelace. And while other players in the industry have been slower to do it, like AMD, for example, which have only recently slowly started to increase their maximum power consumption, I don't think the temptation to increase power consumption just to get the crown is going to be more and more, should I say, great. The temptation will be greater, and companies will not be able to resist it, right? Or at the very least, not every company, but there will be some. And this is where we transition into Apple and Apple Silicon, right? And the future of x86 in general, which really is at the heart of this piece, right? x86 has been the de facto standard for PCs for eons. Everyone tried to supplant it, and all of them failed. Even Intel with their Itanium, they were unable to append it. And so AMD's version, which was a 64-bit update to x86, eventually won out, right? But that may be changing now with Apple's decision to abandon Intel entirely in favor of their own architecture and architectural design and CPU. We may be seeing a road where x86's dominance is slowly being numbered. And I've gone ahead, back and forth inside my head over how fast and how disruptive this all would be, right? Because this has happened before, technically speaking. Microsoft tried to break the Wintel alliance with Windows for ARM, right? And they failed spectacularly, and the Surface RT and the other services that, with ARM processors that came along with them aren't really as widespread as their more common x86 counterparts. I mean, when was the last time you saw a Windows on ARM device? But this time it may be different because it's Apple that's doing it. And Apple has, unlike Microsoft or Intel, complete control over the hardware and the software of their devices. And they are able to optimize every last bit and control every last bit of their operating system and of their architecture in order to optimize it as extremely as possible. And this may just be the push that starts the ARM revolution for desktop and mobile. And again, I've gone back and forth inside my head over how fast and how disruptive this really would be. And the answer that I always come up to is that x86's days are slowly being numbered. But it's not going to be as fast as some people have predicted when M1 started to bat the shit on Intel and their efficiency, right? It's not going to be as fast as many people predicted it would be. And the reason for that is that even in the tech industry, when progress can literally turn your multi-$1,000 computer into a mediocre one within the span of a few years, it's not going to be as fast of a transition because of just how massive and how entrenched x86 is to the desktop. Even in Mac, where Apple literally has to control over their operating system in order to make it more and more ARM focused and switching away from x86, right? Legacy systems are going to exist for a very long time and have continued to exist for a very long time. And that's the reason why I think x86 will continue to exist and will continue to stay relevant and even partially dominant. But there will come a point in time when companies will have to choose, right? When Intel, the creator and defender of x86, will have to choose whether to continue their own architecture forward or switch to a new one, knowing that x86 has its flaws. ARM also has its flaws, but both are now being weighed as options, right? It's not just a one plate game in your table. There are now two plates slowly being served at you, and the one that's new is becoming to look more and more enticing because of what's going on in the competition on the other plate, right? And this collision between power consumption and the power crisis that we're going on is going to decide which end of the spectrum history will play out, right? Will x86 die, or will it continue to survive but only as a minor legacy ISA compared to more efficient RISC systems like ARM? Or will it continue to stay relevant and dominant for years to come, playing essentially on equal footing with ARM? Or will ARM inevitably not be able to break into the desktop? There are many possibilities here, and it's all going to be decided by consumer preference, by the how fast and how steady the transition is to ARM will be, how well the execution of this transition is going to play out, and the power crisis that we're going on right now, and how companies respond to them. Because Apple made a big gamble here by abandoning Intel and building their own SoC. They essentially put all of their control within themselves, and means that if they fumble, they have only themselves to blame. And that's a scary thing, but that also gives them incredible amounts of control to optimize the experience for the user and make it as magical as possible, right? It has allowed them to essentially make fanless Macs that have been impossible on Intel for decades now. And that execution of a dream that once didn't really make sense at all is starting to become more and more enticing to the PC, where the competition is literally heating up, right? Power consumption creep is also slowly getting into mobile. And while on the mid to low end, not as fast as um, it's not as fast as what it is in the high end, it's still sort of affecting it in some way, right? And it's this difference in philosophy that's really the turning point of the entire industry, I think. And it's that Apple found a way to take ideas that have already been explored and like combine them all in a way that gives them a massive advantage, right? Technically, none of what they did are really special. They use TSMC silicon, or TSMC's process node. They use ARM, which is a licensable ISA and is being used by many other companies. They have their own custom cores, which is not uncommon in the industry, right? Everyone can develop ARM cores so long as they have the license, and they have their own custom made silicon, like the GPU, like other processors, AI, etc. All of those can be produced by literally anyone with an R&D budget, and even not the same R&D budget as Apple. They can literally companies can build their way into this, but only Apple has been able to make this transition because of the amount of control that they have. And don't kid yourselves here. This is not just happening in the CPU space. If you think Apple is only focusing on Intel and AMD and x86 in general in their assault here, you are dead wrong. They are making way into the graphics department, into compute, and they want to control everything. They want to be ahead of the game, or at the very least, scare these companies off in order to place their dominance over the computer industry. And it's in the graphics especially that's going to become very heated very quickly, right? We already know how much Nvidia wants to keep their performance crown by literally how much power they're willing to push into their GPUs. And that is an indication that they're aware of the competition, and yet they're also aware that their crown will not last forever, and so they're trying to push power forward without really thinking about the sheer amount of power that they're pushing into the systems right here. And they're making it so that the trend towards higher power consumption is continuing, right? Apple, for their part, isn't doing that. They're doing the slow, methodical approach of making their processors more and more and more and more optimized and more efficient. And by essentially sort of cheating, they're using fixed function hardware in order to beat out the competition, right? It's like, consider the decoders and encoders that they have on their silicon. Those are bonkers. To be able to decode like 5 to 8K streams simultaneously is ridiculous, right? And it's not a new idea. It's essentially decoders and encoders that are purpose built for that purpose had existed since Intel QuickSync over a decade ago in 2011 when it was introduced in Sandy Bridge, right? And that was a revolution. That meant that you didn't need CPU or GPU power in order to encode and decode H.264 video, right? You didn't need the precious CPU power that back then wasn't as much as it is now. We take it for granted nowadays that any CPU or GPU can handle H.264 decoding, but that wasn't always the case. And the inclusion of a fixed function hardware that essentially collected all of it and made it significantly more efficient was the cornerstone of modern day decoding and encoding. Almost every CPU and GPU now has an encoder and decoder that's built into their systems, and they rarely even need the actual power of the CPU and the GPU to actually encode and decode it because to actually encode and decode it because like there's a processor for that essentially. And this strategy is something that Apple is really pushing forwards, and I think will be the direction that the industry is going. Specialization and integration, which on the surface may seem like fairly mutually exclusive ideas. How can you integrate if you specialize? But that's essentially what Apple is doing here. And again, this isn't a new idea either. SoCs have been around for decades, and combining every piece of an entire system, the CPU, the GPU, the fixed function hardware that's responsible for AI, encoding and decoding, etc., and even memory into one package has essentially been around for a very long time now. But the idea that every one of those silicon is purposefully built for one purpose and maybe a few slightly related ones is something that Apple is taking to heart right now and optimizing for it. This is a timeline where we're going to see fixed function hardware and every step of the way. Intel, AMD, and Nvidia are all following in this lead, as well as other companies across the entire industry. Qualcomm, MediaTek, all of them are following Apple's lead right now on integrating but specializing. And that means that we're going to be seeing fixed function hardware that will become obsolete when the standards are going to be phased out, right? And again, this is a conversation of x86's death, right? It's not going to be that every standard is going to die a painful death and the silicon that we use to build them is going to be completely obsolete, right? That's not the case completely. But it's going to mean that a lot of the performance that we have right now may not be as future-proof as if, say, actually increasing the compute capabilities of our GPUs or increasing the performance of our CPUs, right? And yet we can't really blame these companies for not doing the latter because we're slowly hitting the plateau in terms of performance, right? I'm not saying leaps and bounds of increases in performance are dead now. The 4090, if anything, killed that assumption when it literally released with, what was it, like 50% higher performance than 3090 Ti back when the 3090 Ti in of itself was a massive performance uplift over the previous generation, even Titan, compute is still going to get faster. And performance is also going to get faster over time. But it's clear that we're slowly hitting some snags along the way that we have to get around them, right? And it's a funny thing. Intel is one of those companies that's slowly pushing for it a lot more towards that direction, right? It started with Alder Lake. It started with introducing performance and efficiency cores for varying purposes, right? Specialization. The next part is going to slowly integrate, and that's going to start in the next gen with Meteor Lake, right? Where we're going to have not just multiple dies in a single package, CPU, GPU, as well as memory, controller, etc. But also multiple process nodes inside that package, right? We have Intel 4 for the compute die of Meteor Lake. We have TSMC N5 for the graphics die for Intel Arc. We're going to have TSMC N6 for their other compute process nodes, etc. This is going to be the way forward as Intel sees it, right? And maybe they're wrong. Maybe integration through disaggregation or specialization is going to be not the way forward, right? Maybe this kind of integration is way too complex for actual implementation and is going to fail. But Intel is betting big on it. Their entire consumer-facing industry is betting big towards this idea, and I don't think they're the only one. AMD is already on the path towards heterogeneous compute, as Intel has been, towards the path that Alder Lake took. And NVIDIA, with their almost acquisition of ARM, certainly has ideas onto entering the CPU market at some point. This is a time when computing is on a crossroads, and that crossroad has multiple forks in it that we just don't know which way the industry will take, right? But I believe that there is a trend line that's going on here, and that is increased power consumption on the top end, increased efficiency, pressures on x86 and other dominant architectures right now, and integration and specialization. These four trends are going to, if not set the industry's future, at the very least guide it forward, right? As these factors collide with reality, and as these companies try to navigate the ship across many differing factors and issues, including facing geopolitical tensions, global recessions, economic instabilities, etc., they are going to be well on their way towards completely changing this industry as we know it. And this is essentially a point in time, right? On May 1st, 2023, when I tried to talk about and predict what's going to happen within the next few years. Actually, I've more or less just talked about what I think the factors are, and if I'm going to predict something, it would be this. Intel's attempt at heterogeneous computing, integration and specialization, etc., following Apple's lead essentially with that, is going to succeed, and it will delay, and it'll probably delay x86's demise. But in order to properly stave off Apple's assault, they either have to work more closely with Microsoft in order to optimize the implementation of heterogeneous compute in Windows, or they're going to have to get their process nodes up to par with the likes of TSMC. Because as of right now, they are still behind, right? And also, the architecture itself has to change. There's simply way too much power on these performance cores that, while they are ahead in IPC, the fact that they're having to push it further, and the fact that their process nodes aren't as developed as TSMC's are, it's going to be a power hog for the meantime, and they have to fix that if they really want this approach to survive. For AMD, I think they will follow Intel's lead here and try to defend their efficiency crown as much as possible. And so they will be much more careful in pushing the power envelope forward, unless Intel decides to just continue on the power train forever. Like as of right now, the 7950X 3D or the 7950X without the 3D or with whatever performs about as well as 3900K with about 50 to 80% less power. And that's a massive advantage in efficiency, and it's probably one that they will continue to push forward, because that's the way that the industry might go at this point, with the power crisis reversing everything that's been going on within the last few years and making people think more about how much power their freaking gaming rigs actually consume. For NVIDIA, this strategy of pushing more watts, the same as Intel, is clearly not sustainable, right? They're already pushing well above 500 watts in some cases, and there's only so much power that you can push within these freaking graphics cards until they literally crash and burn. And that will give AMD the power to flex their multi-die configurations right now, which they have an advantage on, and probably take the performance crown in the short term. In the long term, they're all going to suffer and have to deal with the increasing complexity of having much more heated competition from the likes of other graphics manufacturers, especially Apple on this side of compute, especially in compute side. And they're going to have to keep going back to efficiency if they actually want this thing to survive. And as for Apple, well, Apple is the hardest company to predict here, because they're as secretive as company can get, and trying to point a finger onto which direction they're actually going to go is difficult in any circumstance. It's not at all trivial to think about. And so what I think I will say here is that Apple's assault on x86's fortress will continue. And if the current powers that be in x86 in the traditional desktop and laptop space, and even on servers, mind you, I haven't talked much about servers, but that's essentially another goal right there for ARM. If the powers that be don't consider efficiency as important as performance, as this global power crisis that we're going on continues within the next few years, I think Apple has a powerful and very sharp dagger to stab into the heart of x86 when the time comes, right? But of course, it's all speculative, right? Maybe they don't intend on completely killing x86. Maybe they aren't even completely confident that they will be able to, just because of how entrenched Windows and x86 is to the tech industry in general, right? But their attempt at it, their perceived attempt at it, is emboldening formerly failed voices like Microsoft's recent advancements into Windows on ARM, Qualcomm's attempt at creating a chip that's powerful enough to break into the laptop market, and other ARM manufacturers slowly getting around to the idea of entering the desktop race, right? We're going to see within the next few years if they succeed or not. But for now, you can't say that computing has not changed within the last 5 years. It has, completely, right? And that doesn't, and while I've focused much on PC today, these things apply for almost all areas of technology. Phones are going to be, there's going to be a revolution in phones in a way that's going to reverse the few decades, or should I say few years, of just slow innovation and there's going to be something that, much like M1 to it, is going to push the industry forward again after being, uh, I guess, fairly boring for the last few years. That's one of the reasons why I didn't actually talk about phones for much within the last year or so. Um, and so that's essentially it. Computing is the computer industry in general has had many ups and downs over the last few years. Like the meteoric rise of PC demand during the pandemic and the spontaneous crash recently has cost companies dearly, right? And it's giving vibes of the same instability that we saw back when innovation was really ramping up in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s. This is a time when everything is changing and the entire computer industry, the entire technology industry is waiting for what that result will be. There are many sideliners here that is just looking at the assault ARM is doing to x86 and seeing if they will falter. Because if that happens, that will embolden other players, other ISAs to follow suit. And maybe, just maybe, the dominant ISA that's been around for 3, 4, probably 5 decades at this point, it's going to all end in a massive furor of more competition, which is good for the consumer, but is going to be, as you would expect, a nightmare for standardization. So we're going to see, I guess, and hopefully this doesn't lead to the increased prices that we've been suffering over the last few years. I'm looking at you, NVIDIA, especially. And while the costs are going up, there is literally, I would say, no justification for the amount of increase in costs that they're doing right now. And the only reason that they do it is because they can. And so disrupting that duopoly, especially in the GPU market, is very important, and I'm rooting for ARC, even if right now it has its fumbles. And so that's essentially it. A future in computing. Maybe not the future, but it's certainly a future that is going to happen and the factors that could lead to it. And so, yeah. It's been 45 minutes, Jesus Christ. Okay, so I'll see you all probably within the next scripted video. I do like it when I actually research these things instead of just spouting. Well, to be fair, I do have a guide right here, but I do much prefer if I have a proper scripted video. It's just that the time that I have right now is very small. I have very little time to spare, and yeah, you may or may not know this, but the reason why the April scheduling was not actually followed is because I had to produce a short film, which you can probably watch right here if you're interested. That's very blatant and very unashameful plug right there. But yeah, I'm planning to do a discussion behind the scenes about that, probably on that channel, but also in here in terms of the technical aspects. Probably. I'm not promising anything because I literally don't have time right now, but we'll see how this goes. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something.